United, Delta, American. Pick any of them. You're at the gate with a boarding pass in your hand, a real ticket you paid for, a seat number printed right there. And the agent looks up and says the flight is full. Full, not foolish, not almost. There is no seat for you, even though you're holding proof that one was yours. And somewhere in that terminal, someone else is holding the exact same proof for the exact same chair. This isn't a glitch. Nobody typed the wrong number. The airline sold your seat to more than one person, on purpose, and it was completely legal when they did it. 2 valid tickets, 1 physical chair. It sounds like a scam, or a mistake somebody's about to get fired for. It's neither. It's a deliberate, decades-old strategy that quietly runs almost every flight you've ever taken. And here's the curious part. It's the reason your ticket was cheap. So how can 2 people both hold a valid claim to the same chair? Because the airline never sold you a chair. What you bought was closer to a promise, and a promise can be made to more than one person at once. Think of your ticket less like a numbered coat check tag, and more like a reservation at a busy restaurant. The table isn't yours. It's the restaurant's, held for you on the expectation that you'll actually turn up to eat. That single shift in thinking changes everything. To you, the cabin feels like a fixed set of assigned places, each one spoken for. To the airline, it isn't places at all. It's inventory. Perishable inventory that vanishes the moment the doors close. And perishable is the key word. A shelf of milk can be marked down before it spoils. But an empty seat that flies from one city to another is gone forever the instant the wheels leave the ground. You can never sell that trip again. So the airline stops treating the cabin as a diagram of chairs to protect and starts treating it as a warehouse of slots to fill. Every slot has to earn its keep before takeoff, which raises an obvious, awkward question. What happens when a slot stays empty? If the cabin is inventory to be filled, then every seat carries a hidden risk the airline can't ignore. Because some of the people who bought a ticket, who fully intended to fly, simply won't be there when the doors close. The meeting runs long. The connection gets missed. The plans change, the flu hits, the traffic on the way to the airport turns a comfortable margin into a closed gate, life happens, and a booked seat quietly goes unclaimed. Here's what makes that empty seat so painful for an airline. It is the most perishable thing they sell. The moment those wheels leave the ground, that seat's value doesn't just drop, it vanishes completely. A grocer with unsold bread can mark it down tomorrow. A hotel with a dark room can rent it next week, but a seat that flies empty from one city to another can never be recovered, resold, or refunded back into existence. That flight only happens once. So imagine the airline flying a cabin with a handful of ghost passengers on every trip. Fuel burned, crew paid, the plane hauled through the sky, all to carry a few pockets of air where paying customers could have been. Now, one missing traveler is a rounding error, but multiply those no-shows across thousands of flights day after day, and you're looking at rivers of revenue leaking out of seats that were technically sold. That is a problem worth solving. So if a chunk of every flight simply never shows, the airline faces a tempting question. If you know some ticket holders will vanish, why not sell their seats again? The trick is knowing how many will vanish. And guessing is exactly what they refuse to do. Every airline sits on years of records. This route, this day of the week, this hour, this season. From all of it, a pattern emerges as steady as a heartbeat. A Tuesday morning commuter run behaves differently from a holiday getaway. Business travelers cancel and rebook. Vacationers rarely skip the trip they save for. So the no-show rate isn't one number, it's a forecast, tuned flight by flight. Here's where it gets clever. The airline doesn't oversell by some wild margin. It sells maybe a handful of extra seats, calibrated to match how many it expects to fall away. A calculated overshoot, not a gamble. It's the same math a big box store uses when it stocks umbrellas before a rainy month. You don't order for the day nobody buys, or the day the shelf's empty. You order for the average, because the average shows up like clockwork. And on almost every flight, it works so smoothly you never notice. The extra tickets sold, the expected no-shows peel away, and the plane pushes back with a full cabin and no drama at the gate. The bet quietly pays off. But a forecast is only ever a probability, and probabilities don't promise. On most flights, the no-shows arrive right on schedule. The math dissolves into an ordinary boarding line, and nobody's the wiser. Then comes the flight where everyone shows up. Every ticketed passenger has checked in. Every carry-on is stowed. The gate agent scans the last boarding pass, and the screen says the same thing it never usually says. There are more people than there are seats. In that moment, the spreadsheet stops being a spreadsheet. The extra ticket the airline sold on purpose, betting a chair would open up, is now a real human being holding a real reservation for a seat that physically does not exist. And here's the uncomfortable truth the airline already knew when it took the money. 2 valid tickets, 1 physical chair. Both promises are genuine, both were paid for. But a metal tube only holds so many bodies, and the physics doesn't negotiate. So the airline is suddenly short. Someone in that line is not getting on this plane. The comfortable abstraction of a demand curve has collapsed into a single question with a very specific answer. Who? That person standing at the gate, the one whose seat vanished into a math error, only exists because of a decision made decades before they were born. Because for most of aviation history, the airline couldn't have run this bet at all. For 40 years, a federal board set the fares, what an airline could charge, which routes it could fly, whether a new carrier could even enter the market at all. Prices were fixed from above, like a menu you weren't allowed to rewrite. If fares are frozen and everyone charges the same, there's no reason to be clever about who sits where. A seat is a seat is a seat. Nobody's forecasting demand when demand can't touch the price. Then, in 1978, Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act. The federal control over fares and routes was pulled away, largely championed by an economist named Alfred Kahn, who believed competition, not a board, should set the price of a flight. And suddenly, the price of a seat was up for grabs. Airlines could undercut each other, new carriers flooded in. The single frozen fare shattered into a scramble, everyone racing to fill planes for less than the airline next door. Cutting prices to fill seats is a fast way to go broke. If the cheap fares are the only fares, you're flying full and losing money. So the real question became almost mathematical. How do you fill a plane without giving the whole cabin away? Someone had to build the machine that answered it. Once fares were free to move, the airline that could price smartest would win. And one man saw that faster than anyone. At American Airlines, Robert Crandall looked at all those empty seats and asked a question nobody had the tools to answer. The question was deceptively simple. How many seats should sell cheap? And how many should be held back for someone willing to pay more? Answer it wrong, and you lose money either way. And no human could do that math for thousands of flights, every single day. So Crandall did something radical. He handed the question to a computer. American built one of the first big systems to forecast demand flight by flight and adjust which fares stayed open, and by how many seats in near real time. This is the machine behind the price you pay. It has a name, yield management, sometimes called revenue management. Its whole job is to squeeze the most money out of a fixed number of seats by predicting behavior and pricing accordingly. And Crandall, who ran American for years, gave the practice its name. He called yield management the single most important technical development in transportation management since the industry entered deregulation. Coming from the man who built it, that is quite a claim. Rivals scrambled to build their own versions because a competitor pricing by instinct simply could not keep up with one pricing by computer. The machine had escaped the lab, and it changed a plane ticket from a fixed price into a moving target. The machine Crandall built wasn't just deciding when to raise a fare, it was doing something stranger. It was taking a single row of identical seats and selling them at prices that had almost nothing to do with each other. 2 people board the same plane. Same cabin, same legroom, same little bag of pretzels. One paid a modest sum booked months ago. The other paid several times that, booked yesterday afternoon, same chair, wildly different receipts. The trick is that airlines don't sell one product on a flight. They sell many. Each price comes wrapped in its own set of rules, and the industry gives these bundles a name, fare classes or booking classes. An airline can carve a single flight into as many of these buckets as it likes. Each one is a different price attached to a different set of conditions, all pointing at the very same physical seats. Why bother? Because not every traveler is the same kind of buyer. Some plan a vacation months out and will hunt for the lowest number they can find. Others need to be in Chicago tomorrow morning, no matter the cost. To the vacationer, price is everything, and time is flexible. To the last-minute business flyer, time is everything, and price barely registers. One will walk away over a few dollars. The other would pay almost anything. So the airline builds different products for different appetites and lets travelers sort themselves. The bargain hunter reaches for the cheap fare. The rushed executive grabs whatever's available. One cabin, quietly divided into separate markets, each paying exactly what it's willing to. If the airline wants to charge the business flyer 4 times what the vacationer pays for the same seat, it runs into one obvious problem. What stops the business flyer from just buying the cheap ticket too? The answer is fences. Not walls around the seat, but rules bolted onto the cheap fare that a high-value traveler can't easily climb over. The price is low on purpose, and it comes wrapped in conditions. The oldest fence is time. To get the low fare, you often have to buy weeks ahead. That single rule quietly sorts the crowd, because the person who plans a vacation months out is rarely the same person who needs to fly tomorrow. Then there's the strangest fence of all, the Saturday night stay. For years, the cheapest fares required you to still be at your destination over a Saturday. A weird little rule with a very deliberate purpose. Think about who wants to be home by Saturday. The business traveler, flying out Monday, back by Friday, itching for the weekend. And who happily stays through Saturday? The vacationer. The rule doesn't ask your income, it just watches your behavior. That's the whole trick. Every fence is a filter designed to be annoying to the traveler who will pay a lot, and painless to the one who won't. The cheap seat isn't really cheap. It's cheap for people willing to jump through hoops. So fences keep the wrong people out of the cheap fares. But that raises a sharper question. How many cheap seats does the airline let out the door in the first place? Because it can't just sell every low fare that someone's willing to buy. Think of the cabin as a set of buckets, all pouring into the same physical seats. One bucket holds the rock-bottom fares, another holds mid-range. Another holds the pricey, buy-it-yesterday tickets. The seats are identical, the buckets are not. And here's the clever part. The airline doesn't open every bucket at once. It rations the cheapest ones, releasing only a handful of seats at the lowest fare. Sell those, and that price simply vanishes. The next buyer sees a higher one. This is inventory control, the quiet engine underneath yield management. A system watching each flight, deciding in real time how many seats to hand over at each price, and holding the rest back like a shopkeeper, keeping the good stock under the counter. As departure creeps closer, the logic flips. The leisure travelers have already booked. Who's left buying tickets days before a Tuesday flight? The business flyer who has to be there, so the system quietly shuts the low buckets off entirely. The goal is never a full plane. It's the fullest plane at the highest total fare the demand can carry. Every seat sold too cheap, too early, is $1 left on the runway. So the airline meters them out, right up to the gate. So the airline shuts off its cheap buckets, fills the plane at the highest revenue it can, and sometimes fills it a little too well. Every ticketed passenger shows up. Now there's a person standing at the gate with nowhere to sit. Here's where the law steps in. A federal rule called Part 250 forbids the airline from simply throwing someone off. Before anyone gets bumped against their will, the carrier has to ask the cabin a question. Who would give up their seat willingly? And that simple requirement turns the gate agent into an auctioneer. The airline needs a seat back. Someone in that crowd is willing to sell theirs. The only question left is the price. So it starts low, a voucher for a few $100s, a later flight. No takers. The offer climbs. More money, a hotel, a meal. Somewhere in that rising number, a passenger's plans and the airline's need quietly meet. It's a real market, running in real time at the gate. The person with the loosest schedule and the highest tolerance for waiting sets their own price. The airline pays it because the seat is worth more to them full than empty. Most days, that auction ends peacefully. Someone takes the money, wanders off to a later flight, and the seat that was quietly sold twice becomes, for a price, sold to just one. But what happens on the day nobody raises a hand? But sometimes the auction runs dry. Nobody at the gate will trade their seat for any offer the airline puts on the table. And now the agent has to do the thing no traveler wants to hear. Choose someone to leave against their will. Here's where the law stops being polite and starts being specific. That same federal rule, Part 250, doesn't just require the volunteer auction first. If it fails, and the airline bumps you anyway, it forces them to pay you a set amount for the privilege. And the payout isn't a flat gesture of goodwill. It's tied directly to your fare. Depending on how long the airline delays you, the rule sets compensation at 200% of your one-way ticket price, or up to 400% for a longer delay. There's a ceiling, though. The percentages don't run to infinity for a wildly expensive ticket. As of 2025, the payout is capped in dollars, roughly up to $1,100 for a shorter delay, and a little over $2,000 for a long one. Notice what the government just did there. It didn't ban overbooking. It didn't call it unfair. It simply attached a receipt to the bad outcome, a fixed price the airline pays every single time its forecast comes up short. So the whole gamble now has a known cost of losing. The airline bets that most flights fill perfectly. The law says, fine, but on the flights where you're wrong, here's the bill. Overbooking stops being a loophole and becomes a line item. So if the law can force an airline to pay you double, triple, even quadruple your fare for losing that bet, you'd think overbooking would be too risky to keep doing. And yet every airline still does it. Every single day. The reason is a simple comparison the airline runs on every flight. On one side sits the occasional payout to a bumped passenger. On the other sits something quieter and far more expensive, the seat that flies away completely unsold. An empty seat is money that can never be earned back. The plane still burns the fuel, the crew still gets paid. That chair rides all the way to the destination and produces nothing. And when the doors close, that revenue is gone forever. So math almost always favors the bet. A handful of payouts across thousands of flights costs the airline far less than the mountain of seats that would otherwise fly empty. The rare loud failure is cheaper than the constant silent one. And here's where it quietly loops back to you. Fuller planes spread every fixed cost across more paying bodies. The fuel, the gate, the crew, the aircraft itself, all divided among more travelers. Cost per passenger drops. And a lower cost is what makes a lower fare even possible. That's the trade the whole system runs on. The airline accepts a small, predictable, occasionally embarrassing cost. In exchange, the plane flies as full as the numbers allow. And the savings from those filled seats ripple down into the fare almost everyone else quietly pays. So the empty seat that flies is money the airline can never get back, and the bet against it is baked into everything. But here is where it all folds back on itself. That bet isn't hidden in some back office. It's already inside the price you paid. When you booked, the airline didn't just sell you a chair, it sold you a slice of a probability. It looked at thousands of flights, forecast who wouldn't show, and priced the whole cabin as if that forecast were already true. And that is the trade you never saw yourself making. To keep those seats from flying empty, the airline shaves the fare for almost everyone. The cheapness is the reward for taking on the risk. Most of the time, the risk stays invisible. But once in a while, the forecast is wrong, everyone comes, and the bet loses out loud at a gate. The very same math that made your ticket cheap is the math that sometimes hands your seat to a stranger. Cheap flights and bumped passengers aren't two problems. They're one machine. There's probably a price you walk past every week that hides a machine just like this one. A number that feels ordinary, until you ask why it's exactly that. Tell me the one you've always quietly wondered about, and subscribe so the next answer finds you. That's the whole reason why we're here.